there were factions within the band that had lost their perspective.
Fuck Stevie Nicks!
Well, it doesn't really matter. The point is that...
Hello and welcome back to Classic Rock Vlogs. Yet again, I have some more classic rock hot takes for you today. I want to talk about the band Fleetwood Mac and the firing of their longtime frontman and guitarist, Lindsey Buckingham. This is a big deal. It is not often that critical core members of behemoth classic rock groups like Fleetwood Mac get fired. And today I want to talk about why they fired him and how they're planning to go forward now without him. But before we get into that, I want to talk briefly about Fleetwood Mac's history, because weirdly enough, there is precedence that you might not know of for the band to tour without Lindsey Buckingham. Let me give you the short version. In the mid-70s, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks were a couple, and they joined Fleetwood Mac as a songwriting team. And upon joining the band, they were successful almost right away. The first album they were on together was a hit record, and then the next record after that, I think, was Rumors, which was not only one of the biggest albums of the 70s, but it's one of the biggest albums of all time. And then every album after that, up until the late 80s, was again another hit record, making Fleetwood Mac one of the biggest bands in all of classic rock. So this stream of successful albums ended in 1987 with the release of Tango in the Night, which, as far as I'm concerned, was the last great Fleetwood Mac album. When they released that album, as soon as it was out, Lindsey Buckingham quit the band. And they were committed to a tour, so they were faced with having to go on without him, and they did. This is important because I think this story relates very closely to what's going on today. Fleetwood Mac has toured without Lindsey Buckingham before. In 1987, they replaced him with Billy Burnett on vocals and guitar, and Rick Vito on lead guitar. They felt that Lindsey was such a major presence in the band, it would take two fairly accomplished musicians to fill the void. Now, I'm not familiar with either of those guys. It's my understanding that they were more behind-the-scenes studio players, but I've seen some video of that tour, and it seems like they, played well enough, and, they got away with it. I think it worked. I've always felt that Lindsey Buckingham is like the most underrated guitarist of the 70s. So, I think, as far as Fleetwood Mac is concerned, he is as important to that band as anybody, including Stevie Nicks. So losing him both then in 1987 and now in 2018, I think his presence being missed will be a big deal for fans. But it really depends on how the band moves forward without him. So after he left in 1987, they did their tour. It was successful. And just a couple of years later, Stevie Nicks quit the band. And believe it or not, Fleetwood Mac actually continued on without her, too. That's what's kind of crazy. A lot of people don't realize that Fleetwood Mac is not Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks and a backup band. They were added on late into Fleetwood Mac's existence, and when both of them left, I think Mick Fleetwood and John McVie and Christy McVie felt, well, we can keep going. And in the mid-90s, they did a tour, but because they were missing their two marquee members, they were like co-headlining a small venues tour or a mid-level venues tour with like REO Speedwagon and Pat Benatar. So things got pretty dire for them without Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. So ultimately, in the late 90s, both of those two come back to the band. They have a full reunion in the late 90s. Then, out of nowhere, Christy McVie the third vocalist in the band, and no small part either. She is often overlooked for Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, but Christy McVie is an absolutely critical vocal element to the band, and she decided to retire and move to England, and she said she had her fill of touring and the music industry, and she wanted to be done. All through the first decade of the 2000s, Fleetwood Mac did tour off and on, just without Christy McVie. Core lineup being Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, Stevie Nicks, and Lindsey Buckingham. In 2009, they were doing their Greatest Hits Unleashed tour. That was the first chance I had to see that band. They played the Bradley Center in Milwaukee. I remember that the tickets were more expensive than I thought they were going to be, especially because it was in 2009, which was a year where the concert industry was still feeling the effects of the economic collapse. So initially I wasn't going to go, but the weekend before the show, ticket prices dropped dramatically. The seat I paid for was $25. I remember it was a great show. They played for a long time. They played all the hits, and Stevie Nicks sang Stand Back, which is my favorite from her solo career, and Lindsey Buckingham played Go Insane, which is my favorite from his solo career. So that they did a great job, but because of maybe how the industry was, or for whatever reason, the Bradley Center was not full at all. It was as if they booked a venue too big for them. The entire upper levels were covered with these thick, blacked out curtains. So you're in a full-size basketball arena, but the upper levels were covered up, and they were just playing to the lower bowl. That's one of the only times I've seen a show like that. But still a very good show. There was not a lot, they didn't talk a lot on stage. The only thing I remember that was particularly funny was at the very end of the show, Mick Fleetwood shouted to the crowd, "The Mac is back." In September of 2011, I saw a Lindsey Buckingham solo show at the Pabst Theater in Milwaukee. You know, it was a much smaller scale show, but still very enjoyable. And he actually talked to the crowd quite a bit, and he was very personable. And I remember the one thing he said that stuck out was he said when Fleetwood Mac tours, he feels as if they are a big machine, and when he does his solo tours, he feels that that's a small machine. And he talked about the differences and the pros and cons of both, I guess. And that was really engaging and enjoyable. So I really liked both of those shows. And there was quite a gap in between Fleetwood Mac tours. Again, that's kind of in the mold of how the Eagles tour, or at least how the Eagles did tour. Big lumbering 2-year tours as the band, and then they take a year or two off or a couple of years off to do solo projects, and then come back in for those big productions and big paychecks. And now they were seasoned professionals who were just out to play for the fans and obviously make a lot of money. And it seemed even more like that in 2014 when Christy McVie, again, abruptly, out of nowhere, just decided she didn't want to be retired anymore, and she wanted to be back in the band. And in 2014, 2015, it was all 5 core members back in the band and touring again. They did another tour. And I saw them in Milwaukee, again, Bradley Center, in February of 2015. And that show might have been sold out. It was a stark difference between how I saw them in 2009 and 2015. 2009, they sold out the lower bowl and maybe a handful of seats in some of the upper sections. In 2015, and again, the tickets were expensive, both shows. In 2015, the place was packed to the gills. It was totally full. And very enjoyable, lots of fun. And it seemed like, oh wow, they're all working together and they're all getting along. So, fast forward to today, or should I say last month, there is still drama. And it culminates with a core member being booted out of the band. That is just so quintessential Fleetwood Mac. See, the thing about that band is they are synonymous with drama. They just always have been. In the 70s, it was the romantic relationships between Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, and that relationship breaking up. And then, of course, John McVie and Christy McVie were married, and they divorced. Stevie Nicks had a lot of high-profile boyfriends, you know. And you're talking about all through the 70s and 80s, they were on just insane amounts of drugs. You know, all of the traditional hang-ups, but with this band, because, you know, they, like, dated each other. And in the 80s, Stevie Nicks had a brief affair with Mick Fleetwood, you know, in the band. So, like, there's all this hilarious high school-esque drama that became part of the band's lore. You know, I'm not saying they're full of drama to, like, insult the band. It's part of their appeal. It's kind of like a social spectacle that there's such a story with the band, and it's, you know, honestly kind of fun to learn about. And since for a while it appeared that drama was over, we now find that was a facade, in that all this time there has been some level of infighting and again more drama. I remember reading a Rolling Stone magazine from a couple of years ago. It was talking about one of the Fleetwood Mac tours, and the interview was with Stevie Nicks. And in the interview, while she's answering questions, someone in a different room in the venue bangs on the wall. And the interviewer is like, "Oh, what was that?" And Stevie Nicks says, "Oh, that's Lindsey." They were playing music during the interview, and she said something like, "Lindsey hates when I play music too loud, and that's his way of telling me to turn off the music I'm listening to." And her response was just classic Stevie Nicks, classic Fleetwood Mac. She goes over and turns the music way up to, like, max volume, just to annoy him more. And it's just like, reading that story was just like, okay, there's still drama. They're still antagonizing each other. And it's still kind of funny, and it's still kind of charming. But as funny as all that can be, it's not really charming if someone in the band leaves. Because now you're talking about a fracture of the organization. And for fans of Fleetwood Mac who really like Lindsey Buckingham, those fans are getting screwed over. Because if Lindsey's their favorite aspect of the band, or his songs, the songs he sings on, are their favorites, they're going to be at a loss because they're not going to be able to see him now when Fleetwood Mac tours this year. So the initial question is, why did they fire him? What was this over? Obviously it wasn't over Stevie Nicks playing music too loud. So the big deal here, the big conflict, was that Stevie Nicks and the rest of Fleetwood Mac wanted to do a tour starting this year, starting in the summer or fall of 2018. And for whatever reason, Lindsey Buckingham did not want a tour until like late fall of 2019, of next year. He wanted them to wait. So they just couldn't come to an agreement. They want to tour now, he wants to tour in a year. And there's been a lot of bands that have broken up over scheduling before, and honestly, those have been some of the worst breaks that I know of. Journey famously broke up with vocalist Steve Perry in the late 90s because they wanted to tour, he didn't. So there's some ugly precedent. So they want to tour right now, he doesn't want to tour right now. That's the impasse. So they say, all right, like it or not, we're going on without you. And he says, okay. Now, of course, both have made some semi-public statements. Fleetwood Mac went on TV. Lindsey Buckingham said some stuff at a fundraiser. When they were on TV, they said they don't want to use the word fired.
Was Lindsey effectively fired?
Well, we don't use that word because I think it's ugly, and it's not a question of that.
but he's fired.
This team wanted to get out on the road, and one of the members did not want to go out on the road for a year.
And then at a fundraiser, Lindsey Buckingham said that the band lost their perspective, which is a gentle way of saying, I don't like that they went on without me.
For the last 3 months, I have sadly taken leave of my band of 43 years, Fleetwood Mac. This was not something that was really my doing or my choice. I think what you would say is that there were factions within the band that had lost their perspective.
Fuck Stevie Nicks!
Well, it doesn't really matter. The point is that...
And Lindsey Buckingham also said some other stuff that was interesting. He said that, this breaks some 43-year commitment or some 43-year legacy he's had with the band, and firing him now changes that.
They'd lost their perspective, and what that did was to harm, and this is the only thing I'm really sad about, the rest of it becomes an opportunity, but it harmed the 43-year legacy that we had worked so hard to build.
Not to get into an argument, but that's wrong. He's been out of the band before for several years at a time. Like I said earlier, in 1987, he quit the band and they toured without him. So there is a strange but very clear precedence that this has happened in that band before. So I don't know how it's different now. I don't want to say I side with Fleetwood Mac on this, but I understand why they fired him. I understand if they want to go now, and Stevie Nicks is on board, and everyone else is on board, and they've been waiting to tour, the idea of waiting another year and a half for Lindsey Buckingham maybe is too much to ask. And it seems that now every year in classic rock, an absolute icon passes away, and they're cognizant of that. Stevie Nicks talked specifically about that, and she says she doesn't see herself doing tours for more than the next 10 years, so she wants to spend these next 10 years being happy and enjoying her life.
We need to take every day that we have until we're gone and make it the best day we can, because if that could happen to Tom, then it could happen to anybody.
And she wants to avoid negative situations, and it's probably easier for them to just cut him loose and say, this sucks, but I want to enjoy what I'm doing, and in this certain circumstance, you're being the frustrating one, so we're all on the same page, we're all going to do this, you don't want to come, that's fine. And if that's their approach, I get it. Lindsey Buckingham also said he's not sad about being fired because, being out of the band is like an opportunity.
And this is the only thing I'm really sad about. The rest of it becomes an opportunity, but it harmed.
As personable and accessible and as nice as that guy seems, that's such Hollywood BS, I don't know what projects he's working on. I know he just did an album a year or two ago with Christy McVie. It was well received. They toured together. I should have went to see him when they were in town, but I didn't. What project is he working on that's so important that this tour had to wait? I'd be curious to see what that is. So if the band is going to tour without him, the question is, how are they going to tour without him? Because I will say this, looking back to 1987, they can't pull Billy Burnett and Rick Vito back into the band and have that just be okay with the fans. And I talked about this explicitly in my vlog about Glenn Frey and how they replaced Glenn Frey with Vince Gill and Glenn Frey's son, and how to me that didn't seem like enough. I felt like those two together don't match the star power and the talent of Glenn Frey. So to demand these insanely expensive ticket prices of fans, and Fleetwood Mac does charge a lot for tickets, you can't just fill the role of an icon like Lindsey Buckingham with studio guys. You need someone who at least approaches that level of talent and star power. So they announced the two people that are going to step in for Lindsey Buckingham on this tour are Neil Finn from the band Crowded House and Mike Campbell from Tom Petty's band, The Heartbreakers. I will just start by saying this is in sharp contrast to how the Eagles handled The Void Left by Glenn Frey. I feel Fleetwood Mac delivered in a much better way than the Eagles did. I think Neil Finn and Mike Campbell are two very good choices. I will say those had to have been Stevie Nicks options. I know that she's very close friends with Mike Campbell. I know that Mike Campbell wrote her very first solo hit song, Stop Dragging My Heart Around. He wrote that music. He wrote the song along with Tom Petty, and they gave her that song back in 1981 to duet with Tom Petty. Bringing Mike Campbell into the band is brilliant. That's a great move. He is a top-tier 70s classic rock guitarist. I think his guitar work is on par with Lindsey Buckingham's, to be honest. And he has a very close relationship with Stevie Nicks, not just because he wrote a song for her, but, you know, in years past, Tom Petty and Stevie Nicks were close friends, and Tom Petty said Stevie Nicks was the only honorary heartbreaker. So there's an established history between her and Mike Campbell. It's going to be very interesting to see him in the band, and I would bet 10-1 with him in the band, Fleetwood Mac will play Stop Dragging My Heart Around in concert, which that's a good song to add to the set list. So I was really impressed with that move. That felt like a seriously good get. So I'm happy about that. Neil Finn. I don't know a lot about Crowded House. I know the big hit, Don't Dream It's Over. I'm guessing that's a vocalist that Stevie Nicks likes. I mean, I know he's a good vocal talent, and if he's only singing a few songs a show, I think that's fine. I mean, I think if the band relies more on Stevie Nicks and Christy McVie's songs, and Neil just sings like the Can't Miss Lindsey songs in concert, I think that's an acceptable move. The real big get, though, is Mike Campbell. Mike Campbell's a big deal. If you go to see Fleetwood Mac this fall, you're going to enjoy seeing Mike Campbell up there with them. So, unlike the Eagles, I actually really like these moves. I think Fleetwood Mac took this very seriously, and I might be a little underwhelmed with Neil Finn because I'm not familiar with him. I am very impressed with them going out and getting Mike Campbell. I think that's a great move. I think that this will be a very interesting chapter. And I also think it'll only be a chapter. I think they're going to tour with this lineup this year and maybe next year. And then I think they're going to go off the road and they're going to go their separate ways. And if I had to guess, I think Lindsey Buckingham will be back. Like, he returned. I mean, he left them before and he came back. This band has always had its ups and downs. They've always squabbled. And even if they're trying to keep toxic fights out of their lives now, Lindsey Buckingham might come around to that too and rejoin them. That said, that I'm hopeful that that will happen in a few years. I would not be surprised if it didn't. I hate to say it, but it's very possible that this is it for the classic lineup. As all of these bands are getting older, it's getting harder and harder for anyone to reconcile. You're seeing less and less of these reunions because bands, the various members of the bands find it easier to just not deal with the people they're fighting with than reconciling and reuniting. I talked about this in my first vlog with, Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar. I'll say it again. That tour, like, if you like Sammy Hagar, give it up. He's not going back in Van Halen, and you're starting to see that more and more because as these people get older, they just don't want to deal with the drama. They don't want to deal with the people that they don't get along with. and it sucks for fans, and maybe it sucks for, like, you know, the legacy of the band or whatever, but, you know, you can't blame them because they don't need to tour. They're all millionaires. They don't need the money. You know, there's nothing forcing them to do it. So when they go out on the road, it's because they love doing it and because they love their fans. And because, of course, they want more money. But there's no... Well, hello, buddy. That's Bruce. So you can't force them to get along if they don't want to. So we might just be seeing the new lineup of Fleetwood Mac. It might now include Mike Campbell, who, again, tragically is out of his main job since Tom Petty's passed away, and maybe Neil Finn.
So neither you, Mike, nor you, Neil, think of this as a temporary gig?
Not at all.
I'm making this my priority until whenever.
The lesson here is that the Fleetwood Mac drama is apparently never over, and it never was. And unfortunately, because of how bad things have apparently gotten in these recent years, Lindsey Buckingham's been fired from the band. That's not just something that you fix overnight. Ultimately, my take on this is that I'm saddened by this firing, but I understand it. I get the motivations behind it. I just hope that the band can make the most of it. I hope this new tour is done really well, and I think it will be, because I think they made strong additions, especially with Mike Campbell. I can't overstate that. I think if you like Fleetwood Mac, you should see them in this lineup, especially if you like Tom Petty, because Mike Campbell was the most important member of that band, besides Tom Petty, obviously. So they should have some fun surprises. So with that, I just want to say thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, please hit subscribe. Please post a comment below. And if you're a fan of classic rock, I host a show on this channel called Play That Rock and Roll that takes a look back at the albums and artists of the classic rock era. It's more scripted. It has plenty of video and audio in those episodes, so I think there's some really good stuff in there. I've talked about Fleetwood Mac in previous videos, so I would invite you to check those out as well. If you have any other ideas on classic rock news items that you'd like me to comment on, please post those suggestions in the comments below. Otherwise, stay tuned to this YouTube channel for some more classic rock hot takes from yours truly. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.